Our tale from Trench Crusade today takes us to the southern border of Verona, close to where hell creeps closer to the holy city of Rome. This is the account of Sister Margite of the Congregation of the Third Meta-Christ, a Stigmatic Nun of the Trench Pilgrims, and of the mission she was given in the autumn of 1915, a mission that took her alone, on foot, through no man's land and into the heart of enemy territory, to kill a man whose death was deemed, by those with the authority to deem such things, worth more than her life. She knew this going in. She accepted it going in. What she did not know was what she would find when she got there, and what it would require of her that was worse than dying. This is Blessed Are the Wounds.
The procession of the Sacred Affliction had made its camp in the ruins of a Venetian farmhouse, 3 kilometers behind the Italian front, close enough to hear the guns, but far enough from the wire that men could sleep without their hands shaking. Close enough was important to the war prophet. She had told Margite once, in a different season, that sleeping beyond the sound of the guns made the soldiers forget what they were. The guns were a reminder. The shaking was not weakness. The shaking was the body being honest about where it stood in the order of things. The farmhouse had been an ordinary farmhouse once. Now it was not. The castigators had done their work on the interior. The walls hung with icons in every available space. The frames gilded and blackened in alternation, according to a symbolic logic Margite had long since internalized and no longer needed explained. Votive candles stood in every alcove and along the tops of the window frames, not for light, which the lanterns provided adequately, but for the smell of rendered tallow and the particular quality of shadow they produced when the lanterns were low. The procession was a people who had strong opinions about shadow. Darkness with candles in it was not the same as darkness without them. Darkness with candles in it was a space in which prayer was possible. Darkness alone was something else. Prophetess Eudokia sat at the farmhouse table when Margite was brought in. She was a small woman, brown-haired, unremarkable in appearance if you had not seen her in the field, and she was dressed as she always dressed on campaign. Heavy wool cloak over the pilgrim's habit. The iron capirote hung on its hook behind her rather than on her head, which she only wore in the field. Her hands were on the table, flat, one on either side of a map that had been annotated in a handwriting too small for Margite to read from the doorway. On the map's margin, in red, someone had drawn a symbol Margite recognized, the mark of the Black Grail's Intelligence Directorate. The internal designation they used for operations, classified above standard field command. Margite had never seen that symbol on a map before. She had seen it on dead men, on things taken from dead men. She stood at the door until the prophetess looked up, and then she crossed the room and stood across the table, and the prophetess studied her for a moment the way she always studied people, which was with the full and specific attention of someone who was seeing more than what was visible. Eudokia had been a prophetess since she was 12 years old. Margite had never asked her what that meant from the inside. It seemed like a question that had no answer worth hearing. "Sister Margite," the prophetess said. "Prophetess, you know why you're here?" "I have been told that I have been selected for a mission. I have not been told the nature of it." Eudokia's eyes held on her for a moment, and then she looked down at the map, and she began to speak in the measured way she had when she was delivering intelligence rather than revelation, a different quality of voice, precise and dry, stripped of the resonance that her words carried when she was speaking as a prophet. His name was Oleander. It was not his real name. The Black Grail's command structure maintained a policy of operational pseudonyms that had been consistent since the early years of the war, and the name that was known to faithful intelligence was Oleander. He was a commissioner of the Seventh Circle's Eastern Intelligence Apparatus, which meant he was a man of the Court of Hell who had been granted partial incarnation and assigned to the war effort. Not an ordinary human servant of Beelzebub, but something intermediate between human and infernal. A thing that wore a man's body with the confidence of someone who understood that the fit was temporary and not especially important. He had been operating in the occupied zones of the Veneto and the territories south of Verona for 4 years, running networks of human collaborators and overseeing what the prophetess described without further elaboration as a program of infernal preparation. Margite asked what infernal preparation meant specifically. The prophetess said, "A ritual of empowerment designed to open a conduit from this location to the seventh circle of hell. If completed, it would allow the direct manifestation of lower nobility, the kind of demonic presence that normally required a great deal of blood and ceremony and specific celestial timing to bring through." Oleander was not the architect of the ritual. He was the officiator. Without him, the junior staff of the operation were not qualified to complete it. The ritual had an externally imposed deadline of the following Thursday, which was dictated by celestial alignment and could not be adjusted. If Oleander was dead before Thursday, the ritual would fail. The seventh circle would need to assemble another qualified officiator, and the celestial window would have closed, and the program would be delayed by months. The faithful's intelligence on this had been obtained at significant cost. The prophetess did not specify the cost. Margite did not ask. "Why me?" Margite said, not out of false modesty or uncertainty, because the operational logic required understanding. Eudokia said, "A stigmatic operates on a different principle than a trained military infiltrator." She did not need to be invisible in the ordinary way. She needed to be guided. The wounds of the third Metachrist, when they manifested in a true stigmatic, did not manifest randomly. They responded to proximity to the sacred and proximity to the infernal. A stigmatic who knew how to read her wounds could navigate toward a source of infernal power through no man's land and occupied territory by something more reliable than intelligence maps. The Faithful's agents had pinpointed Oleander's location to a village called Caldiero, 7 kilometers inside the occupied zone, in a commandeered abbey that had been converted to his operational use. But the abbey had multiple structures, and the intelligence was 3 days old. A map could tell Margite where the village was. Her wounds would tell her where in the village to find him. "Alone," Margite said. "A second operative is a second risk," the prophetess said, "and the wounds work for 1, not 2. Margite looked at the map. Caldiero was a small notation, south of the wire, south of the occupied line, on a road that ran between 2 larger towns. The abbey was marked with a cross in the same red hand that had drawn the intelligence mark. She looked at the distance from the front to Caldiero. 7 kilometers. Through the wire, through the mud, through the occupied territory where every movement by a faithful soldier was a crime that was punished by death, and where the civilian population had been living under Black Grail oversight long enough that some of them could not be counted on to be quiet about what they saw. "When do I leave?" she said. "Tomorrow night," the prophetess said. "The ritual begins Thursday at first light. You have 2 nights and a day." Margite nodded. There was nothing else to say about the feasibility. Feasibility was a category that did not apply to this kind of work. Either the Lord would guide her wounds and she would find Oleander and she would kill him, or she would die somewhere between here and Caldiero, and the ritual would proceed, and there would be a different problem for different people to solve. "I'll need to see the full intelligence brief," Margite said. "Everything your networks produced. Names, patrol patterns, whatever is known about the Abbey's layout and the number of staff." "Brother Arsenios will bring it to you tonight," the prophetess said. "And I'll need 2 hours with the armourers," Margite said. "The blade needs the oil of chrism, applied correctly. Last time it was done in a hurry. The armourers are yours from midday." Margite stood. The prophetess was looking at the map again, and Margite understood that the audience was over, and she was almost to the door when Eudokia said, without looking up, "The wounds will be worse on the other side of the wire. The infernal preparation has been underway for weeks. The area around the abbey will be saturated in the way those sites become. You should understand that before you cross." Margite stopped. "I understand it." Understanding it and experiencing it are different. "Yes," Margite said. "They are." She went out. Brother Arsenios brought the intelligence brief at 10 o'clock and stayed while Margite read it, which she appreciated. It meant she could ask questions and receive immediate answers rather than sitting with the ambiguities until morning. The brief was 11 pages of close handwriting, and Margite read slowly, the way she always read documents whose content she needed to retain without reference because she would not be carrying papers across the wire. The Abbey of Sant'Ilario at Caldiero had been constructed in the 13th century and significantly expanded in the 17th. It had a church, a chapter house, a cloister with a garden that had been paved over at some point in the previous century, a gatehouse, a cellar complex that extended beneath the chapter house and the church both, and a series of outbuildings to the east that had served various agricultural purposes. The agricultural outbuildings were now, according to the intelligence, used as barracks for the security staff. There were between 12 and 15 of them, human collaborators, Italian collaborators who had chosen the winning side early and now performed enforcement functions for the occupation. They were not soldiers of the heretic legions. They were not infernal in nature. They were ordinary men who had made a particular decision and had been living with the consequences of that decision for 4 years. This did not make them less dangerous to Margite. It made them slightly more predictable. Oleander himself was in the chapter house, according to the last confirmed sighting, which was 6 days old. The ritual preparation required proximity to the crypt, which was accessed from the chapter house. The crypt was where the ceremony was to be held. Margite noted this, and noted the layout of the chapter house, and noted the 3 confirmed entry points, and then she set the brief aside and told Arsenios she was ready for the armourers. They came to her room because she did not go to theirs. This was the practice among Stigmatic Nuns, who carried wounds that were not to be exposed to every eye in the camp. There were 2 of them, serious men in the middle years of their lives, and they had what she needed: the sword, the pistol, the oil of chrism in its sealed glass vessel, and the bandaging materials for the wounds. The sword first. It was a straight-bladed weapon, not long, designed for the close quarters of a room or a trench, where the long cavalry sabre became a liability rather than an advantage. The blade was narrow and double-edged and had been made by the pilgrims' own artificers from steel that had been quenched in water from the River Jordan, which was the practice for blades designated for infernal combat. Margite had carried this sword for 3 years. She knew its weight and its balance and its particular way of catching the light, and she watched the senior armourer apply the oil of chrism to the blade with the cloth wrapped correctly around his hand, the strokes running from hilt to tip in the proper direction, because the direction mattered, and she confirmed that he was doing it correctly, and he was, this time. Last time he had reversed the strokes on the upper third of the blade, which would have mattered if she had been fighting anything above the rank of minor infernal. She had said so at the time, and apparently it had been remembered. The pistol was simpler. It was a Colt revolver, old but reliably maintained, loaded with rounds that had been blessed in the ordinary way. Blessed ammunition was not extraordinary. It was standard issue for anyone operating in proximity to infernal presences. What was extraordinary was the silence modification that the procession's artificers had fitted to the barrel. A bulky construction of wrapped wire and compressed wool that would not survive more than 4 or 5 shots before its effectiveness diminished, but which would muffle the report to something no louder than a hand slap for those 4 or 5 shots, which was all she expected to need if everything went well, and she was not planning for things to go well. Then the wounds. The armourer's assistant handed her fresh bandaging and turned his back, and the senior armourer turned his back also, and Margite unwound the old dressings from her palms, her wrists, her feet, and the wound on her left side that corresponded to the lance wound, the last and worst of the 5, which had been weeping continuously for the past 2 days in a way that suggested heightened proximity to something infernal even here. 3 kilometres behind the wire. She redressed them herself, the way she always did. The technique mattered. The bandaging had to be firm enough to slow the bleeding without restricting movement, and the placement of the cloth over the wound mouth had to be exact. The wounds would bleed through anything eventually. The goal was to slow the rate to something manageable for the duration of the mission. She thought about what the prophetess had said. Saturated. It was the right word for what happened to ground where infernal preparation had been ongoing for weeks. The air acquired a specific quality, dense and pressured, like the moment before a thunderstorm, but without the promise of relief that a thunderstorm carried. It pressed against the wounds from the outside, like fingers probing a bruise. The pain would be consistent and significant from the moment she crossed the wire, and it would increase as she approached the abbey, and it would be worst inside the crypt. She had been in saturated ground once before, on a reconnaissance 3 months ago, closer to the front and less deeply saturated than what she was being told to expect in Caldiero. That experience had been educational. The wounds had bled through 2 full sets of dressings in 4 hours. Her ability to move quietly had been affected, not her will, but the physical reality of blood soaking through cloth and reaching the outside surfaces of her boots. Blood on the floor of an occupied building was the kind of evidence that did not require an expert to read. She would need to manage this carefully. She finished the dressings and told the armourers they could turn around. The senior armourer handed her the completed sword without looking at her hands, which was correct practice. He told her the chrism oil would remain active for 48 hours, which was the standard operational window for a correctly applied treatment. She would be back before the window closed, or she would not be back, and in either case, the oil would not be the limiting factor. She thanked them. They left. She sat with the sword across her knees for a while, in the candlelight, and read the intelligence brief a second time, the whole 11 pages. And then she set it aside and sat with nothing in her hands, and no thought that she was aware of. Only the sound of the guns to the south, and the smell of the candles, and the particular quality of the pain in her side, steady and familiar, that had been her companion for 7 years. Then she slept. The castigator who saw her off at the wire was a man named Brother Obededom, which was not the name he had been born with. Castigators took the names of saints and prophets when they took the whip, as a reminder of whose authority they administered and whose they did not. He was a tall man with grey eyes and a calm that was not indifference. She had seen him weep once, over a body in the mud, a penitent girl who had not been older than 16, though the castigator had wept facing away from the camp so that nobody would see him doing it. He had a scar on his jaw from a trench knife, and he carried the castigator's scourge at his belt alongside a revolver and a straight razor that she suspected had been used for more than shaving. He held the wire back for her without ceremony and without speech, and she ducked through and straightened and turned back to look at him through the gap in the wire. And he looked at her with those grey eyes that had seen enough to stop requiring commentary on what they saw. "Come back," he said. She nodded. She turned and walked south into the dark. No man's land at night in October was a specific kind of nothing, not peaceful. Nothing about no man's land was peaceful. It was a landscape where peace had been removed with such thoroughness that the concept no longer applied to it, the way a word that has been used too many times loses its meaning and becomes just sound. It was simply nothing. Darkness and mud and the smell of things that had died in sufficient quantity that the ground itself had absorbed them and become a different substance from what it had been before the war came to it. The Italian front had been settled into its present configuration for 2 years in this sector. 2 years was long enough for the ground to change character entirely. She moved slowly, which was the only way to move in no man's land at night if you were not a fool. Slowly and low, on her hands and knees through the worst of the crater fields, flat on her belly when the parachute flares went up and turned everything blue-white for 30 seconds before they died. The flares came from the heretic lines, irregularly spaced, the product of some nervous soldier's finger on the launch cord. She had learned, in 3 years of crossing no man's land, to read the rhythm of a sector's nervousness from the flare pattern. This sector was running a flare every 8 to 12 minutes, which was not especially nervous. A worried position ran every 3 or 4. 8 to 12 minutes gave her reasonable windows. She was 50 meters into the crossing when the wounds in her palms opened. Not dramatically. Not with the burning quality that the more emotional accounts in the hagiographies described, the sensation of heat and holy fire. That was not her experience of the wounds, and had not been since the first year when her body was still learning how to carry them. What she felt was a deepening of the existing pain, a shift from the background ache that was always present into something more focused, more present, that required active management rather than passive tolerance. It was like the difference between a note played softly and the same note played loudly. Same pitch, same fundamental quality, just more of it. She paused in a shell crater and pressed her palms against her knees and breathed deliberately until the initial intensity settled into its new baseline. The prophetess had been right. The saturation was already present here, still on the near side of the wire, a faint but unmistakable pressure that told her the infernal preparation was not confined to the abbey's immediate perimeter. It was spreading. A week of preparation in a sealed space, and the corrupted quality of the ritual work leaked outward the way water leaked through soil, finding the lowest available path. She moved on. The crater field was the worst of it for the first kilometre. The craters were irregular and deep, some of them flooded to a depth she couldn't judge until she had gone in ankle-deep and had to redirect around them, adding time she did not want to lose. In 2 of them, she found what she expected to find in the crater fields of a 2-year front. Human remains, mostly skeletal, in various stages of dissolution into the surrounding mud. She did not look at them longer than was necessary to navigate around them. The dead in no man's land had long since ceased to require her attention as individuals. They were features of the ground, like the craters and the wire and the occasional rusted remnant of a machine gun emplacement that had been abandoned or destroyed in some action long past. The wire in the middle of the crossing was the technical problem. The Faithful's wire teams had been through here in preparation for her crossing. She knew this from the briefing. A narrow gap had been cut and marked with a scrap of white cloth on the left post at knee height, and she found the gap without difficulty, but the heretic wire on the far side was her own problem, because the Faithful's teams did not cut heretic wire if they could avoid it. A cut in the heretic wire was evidence of a crossing, evidence of a gap, evidence that invited a patrol. She had a small pair of cutters in her kit, carried exactly for this purpose. She found the lowest strand and worked at it until it parted, then bent the ends back carefully so that they caught less of the ambient light. And she did the same with the second strand and the third. And she went through on her belly with 3 centimeters of clearance above her back, which was adequate, though the sword's hilt at her hip added a centimeter she had to account for. On the other side, she stopped and listened. Heretic Line was 40 meters to the south. She could see the parapet in the flare light, a low ridge of sandbags and timber, less well-maintained than the faithful's own parapet. Light in 2 positions, which she had noted in the briefing as consistent with the guard pattern. 2 sentries on this section, 1 per 50 meters of parapet, rotation every 2 hours, and she was crossing in the 3rd hour of the watch, which meant both sentries had been standing for long enough to be past their sharpest alertness and not yet tired enough to be erratic. The gap in the Heretic Line was in the briefing too, a section of trench that had been abandoned 4 months ago and not reoccupied, a low point in the parapet that she could cross standing upright if she went quickly. She found it in the darkness by counting from the nearest light position, moved to it at a crawl and crossed in 3 steps, and then she was in the trench, ankle-deep in the water that stood in all these trenches in October, moving southward along the duckboards as quietly as she could manage, with water sloshing at each footfall. 40 meters, and she reached the trench's southern exit, a cut in the parapet that led to a supply path running back from the line. She went up the cut and out into the open ground south of the trench and stopped again and listened, and then she was out. Past the line, past the wire, on the wrong side of everything, in the dark, with 7 kilometers between her and Caldiero. She adjusted her dressings where the crawling had disturbed them. The palm wounds had soaked through to the outer layer, which was earlier than she had hoped, and she turned south and began to walk. She walked for 3 hours in the dark before she stopped. The ground south of the trench line was cleaner than no man's land. It was lived-in ground, or had been before the occupation, which meant it still carried the residual organization of human settlement. Lanes between fields. Ditches with purpose. A road that she found by the quality of the surface under her feet, harder than the surrounding ground, and followed at a careful distance, taking a parallel line through the field margin rather than the road itself, because roads at night in occupied territory were patrolled, not always, not reliably, but often enough that the field margin was worth the additional difficulty. She passed through a village at 2 in the morning. Not through it, around it, wide, giving the buildings enough space that she could not be seen from any window, and the dogs, if there were dogs, would not catch her scent. There were lights in 2 houses. One of them, a large stone structure on the north edge of the village, had a heretic military pennant over the door. Billet. She gave it 500 meters of clearance and went through the orchard east of the village, the apple trees dark and stripped of fruit, and came out on the far side of the village on a farm lane that ran northeast in approximately the direction she needed. At 4 o'clock, she found a place to wait out the daylight. It was a drainage ditch at the edge of a field of harvested beet, 2 meters deep and full of dead vegetation from the summer that had accumulated along one bank in a low, dry heap. And she dug herself into it with her shoulders and pulled the dead stalks over her legs and lay still. This was not ideal. She was wet to the knee from the trench and the creek she had waded crossing a valley, and the ditch was cold, and lying still in cold, wet clothing for 6 hours was the kind of thing that did the body no favors. But it was better than a barn or a building, which required proximity to people who might be indoors for unpredictable reasons, at unpredictable times, and the drainage ditch had the advantage of being genuinely uninteresting. Nobody went to a drainage ditch unless they needed to clear it, and the recent weather had been dry enough that the ditch was running low, which meant it did not need clearing. She ate what she had in her kit, hard bread and dried meat and a small amount of rendered fat from a waxed cloth packet, the pilgrim's travel ration, plain and calorie-dense. She drank carefully from her water bottle, not all of it, because she did not know the local water sources, and refilling from a stream south of the line was a risk she would accept if she needed to and not before. She checked her dressings in the first grey light. Both palms had bled through. The side wound, the lance wound, the worst of the 5, had soaked through its dressing and begun to spread into the fabric of her habit on the left side. Not dangerous, not yet, not in the clinical sense. Wounds of this kind did not become dangerous from blood loss unless the saturation was extreme. What they became was difficult to conceal. Dark staining on a dark habit in low light was passable. In full daylight, at close range, it was not. She had additional dressings in her kit. She used 3 of the reserves on the palm wounds, which bought her additional time, and 2 on the side, and she calculated what remained and what she expected to need on the far side of the mission, and she concluded that she had enough if the return journey was faster than the approach, which it would be if things went well and she survived, and if things did not go well, she would not need dressings on the return journey. There was a logic to this that was not comforting, but was at least clear. She settled into the ditch and watched the field brighten from grey to pale gold as the sun came up behind low autumn cloud, and she thought about the wound in her side, which she had been carrying for 7 years and which she understood better than she understood most things in the world. It had come to her in her 17th year, the last of the 5 to manifest, and she had nearly died of it. Not of blood loss, the church's physicians had been clear about that, but of the shock of the pain, which was not a metaphor. The pain of the lance wound was not ordinary pain. It was not the pain of a cut or a bruise or a deep muscle injury. It was a kind of knowledge, delivered in the language of the body, that was about something beyond the body. She had understood this gradually over the first 2 years of carrying it. It did not stop hurting. She had never expected it to stop hurting. What changed was what she did with the information it carried. The prophetess called it navigation. She preferred navigation to the hagiographic language. Sacred wounds, divine suffering, the blood of the blessed, which was accurate but imprecise in the way that all accurate imprecisions were. The wounds were not metaphors. They were not primarily symbols. They were a physical mechanism for perceiving something that ordinary human senses did not perceive. They hurt because the mechanism required tissue response to function, the way a nerve ending required stimulation to transmit. And the stimulation, in this case, was proximity to the sacred or the infernal, which were aspects of the same fundamental distinction, which was the distinction between what belonged to God and what had been taken from God and used for other purposes. Oleander, at the center of his weeks-long infernal preparation, would be radiating the latter in quantities that would be unmistakable. She would have no difficulty finding him. The difficulty would be killing him, and then leaving. She lay in the ditch until midday. The farm showed no signs of occupation. The beet field had been harvested, and she could see the farmhouse at the north edge of the field, and nobody came or went from it. The lane running alongside the ditch carried a horse cart at 9 in the morning and a pair of soldiers on bicycles at 10:30. And she lay still under the dead stalks, and they passed 30 meters away without looking in her direction. The soldiers were young. She could hear them talking. They were complaining about the food at the billet in a tone so specifically weary and mundane that it could have been soldiers from any army, in any war, complaining about food in any language. There was nothing particularly infernal about them. They were men who had chosen something, or been given no real choice about it, and were now hungry and bored and a long way from wherever they were from. She watched them pass and felt nothing about them either way. They were obstacles, or they were not. Right now, they were not. If they had stopped and looked into the ditch, they would have been, and she would have done what was necessary. And then she would have needed to change her timeline. They did not stop. At noon, she ate the rest of the bread and the last of the dried meat and drank half of what remained in her water bottle. And she watched the cloud that had moved in from the west and calculated that the weather would hold through the night, which was useful. Overcast nights were darker, and dark was her preference. Then she lay on her back in the dead vegetation with the cold seeping through her habit and the wounds doing what they did steadily and without drama, and she waited for the dark. She reached the outskirts of Caldiero at 10 o'clock. The town was not large. The briefing had called it a town, which was generous. It was a market village that had grown in the way of Venetian market villages, around a church square and a canal, with a brewery at the southern end and a modest cluster of stone houses that had served the tradespeople and the more prosperous farmers of the surrounding country. Before the occupation, it would have had perhaps 1,000 inhabitants. The briefing did not estimate the current population. It was not the kind of information that was easily verified from the outside. The Abbey of Sant'Ilario was on the eastern edge, half a kilometre past the last houses of the village proper, separated from the town by a stone-walled lane and a small cemetery that adjoined the abbey's own grounds. This was useful. It meant that approaching the abbey did not require passing through the occupied centre of the town, only through the margin of it, which was less densely populated and less well lit. She approached from the south through the allotment gardens that ran along the back of the southern houses, and she could see the town clearly enough in the thin light of a quarter moon. There was electric light in the market square. The Black Grail's logistical apparatus had extended the grid to this village, which was not universal in the occupied zones, but was consistent with the presence of a significant operational asset. And the light from the square reached far enough to give the surrounding streets a pale amber wash that was enough to see by and not enough to see well. It created a zone of misleading visibility, which was worse in its way than complete darkness because it tempted the eye into confidence it could not justify. There was a patrol. She had expected a patrol. 2 soldiers moving together, unhurried, following a route that took them around the market square and down the main street and back. They carried lanterns as well as rifles, which was operationally useful. The lanterns told her exactly where they were from 200 meters away, and the lanterns destroyed their night vision for anything outside the lantern's immediate circle of light, which meant that anything in the margin of shadow around the lit zone was more invisible to them, not less, than it would have been in full darkness. She waited in the allotment gardens for 15 minutes and timed the patrol. They were consistent, the same route, the same pace, approximately 18 minutes per circuit. This was the behaviour of men who were not worried. A patrol that was worried varied its route and its pace. These were men doing a job they had done many times without incident in a town that had given them no problems. She did not resent this. It made her work easier. Between the allotment gardens and the lane that led to the abbey, there was one street to cross. She crossed it between patrols. At a walk, running in an occupied zone was conspicuous in a way that a steady, purposeful walk was not, and a woman in dark clothing moving with purpose at 10 o'clock had at least a plausible civilian interpretation if someone saw her, whereas a woman running had no interpretation that did not require explanation. She walked across the street and through the gap in the house opposite where a gate had been removed and not replaced, and into the back garden of a house that was dark and apparently empty, and through the garden and over the back wall and into the lane on the far side. The lane ran southeast between stone walls, following the line of the abbey's boundary wall. There were no lights in the lane. There was a smell, faint but present, that she identified as the saturation. Not a physical smell exactly, but a quality of the air that registered as smell, the way a change in atmospheric pressure registered as a change in sound. She had felt it in no man's land, hours earlier, as a mild pressure. Here it was stronger. She was 300 meters from the abbey. Her wounds told her she was 300 meters from the abbey. She moved slowly in the lane, staying against the left wall, testing her footing before committing her weight at each step, because the lane was uneven and a turned ankle here was a mission-ending problem. The wound in her side had intensified again. It was now the dominant pain in a way it had not been during the approach, which told her that the infernal presence was not uniformly distributed but concentrated. A source, not a field. The preparation was centered on a specific point, not spread across the whole abbey complex. Good. That was the crypt. That was what the briefing had said. The crypt, directly beneath the chapter house. She was feeling the crypt from here. The lane ended at the corner of the abbey's east wall, where a wooden gate gave access to the cemetery. The gate was unlocked. The cemetery was dark and still and had the quality of all old cemeteries at night, which was not, in Margite's experience, sinister. The dead in consecrated ground were simply absent in a way that was peaceable rather than threatening. The opposite quality from what she was walking toward. She moved through the cemetery between the headstones and stopped at the inner wall, the wall that separated the cemetery from the abbey's own grounds, and she looked over it. The courtyard of the abbey was lit by 2 lanterns on iron brackets, one by the main gatehouse entrance and one by the door of the chapter house. The church itself was dark. The agricultural buildings to the east were dark except for a single light in one window. A guard post, probably. Someone assigned to watch the approach from the road. The chapter house had a light in the room directly above the door, not in the crypt, which did not have windows, but in the room above, which was a warming room according to the briefing's architectural notes. Someone was awake in the warming room. She counted the visible positions: the gatehouse lantern, the warming room light, the east building guard post, 3 known positions. She could not see the main church door from here, and the cloister walk on the south side of the courtyard was in shadow deep enough that she could not confirm whether anyone was stationed there. She stayed at the wall for 10 minutes, watching. A door opened at the east building, and a man came out, moved to the edge of the building to urinate against the wall, went back inside. One man in the east building, not sleeping, probably on watch rotation. The warming room light stayed constant. The gatehouse showed no movement. She did not like the cloister walk's shadow. She could not clear it from here. The wound in her side pulsed. She had learned, in 7 years, to distinguish between the wound's qualities. The steady ache was presence. The sharp-focused pulse was direction, a refinement of the navigation, the way a compass needle didn't just point north, but moved toward it when you tilted the housing. The pulse was telling her to move. The pulse was telling her that what she was here to find was close enough that waiting was the wrong choice. She moved her hands to the top of the wall, found her purchase, and went over. She dropped into the abbey grounds and stayed crouched against the wall for 30 seconds with her back to the stone, listening. Nothing moved in the courtyard. The lanterns by the gatehouse and the chapter house door cast overlapping circles of light that left the section of wall where she had come over in shadow, which she had calculated from the cemetery side before going over. She was in the shadow margin, against the east wall, in the gap between the cemetery boundary and the edge of the east building. From here, she could see the courtyard, the cloister walk to the south, and the church door. The cloister walk was occupied. She could see a figure at the far end of it, standing still, a darkness against the darker architecture. A single man, at the south corner, facing the courtyard. She had not been able to see him from the cemetery wall because of the angle. Now that she had his position, she also had his field of view: the gate, the church door, and the central courtyard. Not the east wall, not the shadow she was standing in. She had 4 positions now: gatehouse, warming room, east building, cloister walk. The briefing's estimate of 12 to 15 men. The 4 positions she could see accounted for a minimum of 4 men, probably more in the east building given its size. The others were in the dormitory, or asleep somewhere in the complex, or in positions she hadn't identified. She needed to reach the chapter house without crossing the lit courtyard. The cloister walk was the answer. It ran along the south side of the courtyard, connecting the south transept of the church to the chapter house, and it provided covered passage in the original architectural intent. The monks who had built this place had moved from their sleeping quarters through the cloister to the chapter house for their daily business without being exposed to the weather. That passage still existed. The problem was the man at the far end of it. She spent 4 minutes watching him. He was not moving significantly. Occasional small shifts of weight, once a movement of the head that might have been him checking something or might have been drowsiness. At the 11-minute mark, he moved, clearly this time, and walked the full length of the cloister walk toward the chapter house end, paused there for a moment, and then walked back to his original position. She timed the walk, 40 seconds each way. He returned to standing and stood still again. A walking guard who stayed within his beat. Not a patrol. She could work with this. The entry point to the cloister walk was the door at the south transept of the church, which was 20 meters from her current position, along the east wall, partly in shadow and partly in the margin of the lantern from the chapter house door. She would need to cross approximately 8 meters of partially lit ground to reach it. 8 meters at a walk, not a run, relying on the guard's attention being directed toward the courtyard and the gatehouse rather than the south transept door. She moved along the east wall to the corner of the church, stopped, listened, watched the cloister guard. He was at the gatehouse end of his beat, facing away from her. She moved. 8 meters, 4 seconds of partial exposure. She reached the south transept door and pressed against it and tried the handle. Unlocked. She went in. The church interior was dark and cold and had the particular quality of spaces that had been drained of their intended function. The pews were still there, heavy oak, old, the kind of furnishing too unwieldy to remove casually. But they had been moved to the sides and stacked, and the nave had been cleared to serve as some kind of storage space. Ammunition crates along the north wall, supply cases along the south, all of it stacked with a practiced efficiency that suggested a long-term presence rather than a temporary occupation. The altar was bare, stripped of its coverings, the cross above it absent, the absence marked by a shadow on the wall where the cross had protected the stone from decades of candle smoke. The shadow of the cross was still there. They had taken the cross, but the shadow remained. She moved up the nave and through the door at the north end that connected the church to the chapter house passage. The passage was low-ceilinged and smelled of cold stone and something underneath it, the saturation, heavier here, coming up through the floor from below. The crypt was directly below her. She could feel it the way you felt heat from a fire through the soles of your shoes, except what she was feeling was not heat. The passage ended at a door. Through it, she could hear voices. She stopped. 2 voices, speaking in German, the tone of the conversation unhurried, a discussion, not a crisis. She listened for 30 seconds and could not make out enough to be useful through the wood. The voices were coming from the left, which was the warming room, which was above the chapter house proper. Not from directly ahead, which would have been the crypt staircase. She tried the door handle slowly. The latch lifted without sound. She eased the door a centimetre and looked through the gap. A corridor, stone-flagged, lit by a single lantern hanging from an iron bracket. 2 doors on the left, one closed, one ajar, the voices coming from the ajar one. On the right, a staircase descending. The crypt. At the foot of the stairs she could see the beginning of a second lantern's light, and from below came the saturation with a weight that made the wounds in both her palms clench simultaneously. A deep, involuntary contraction that she felt in her forearms and had to consciously release. Oleander was below. She was certain of this with the certainty that was not inference, but was instead the wound's direct report, which she had learned to trust more than any intelligence brief. He was in the crypt, or in a room adjacent to it, and he was close enough that the saturation was no longer a field, but a direction, a clear vector pointing down the stairs, the way a sound grew louder as you approached its source. She held the door at 1 centimetre for another 20 seconds, tracking the voices in the warming room for any sign of movement toward the door. Nothing. She went through, turned right, and went carefully down the stairs to the crypt. The stair was 12 steps and opened into an antechamber. She stopped at the last step and stayed there for a long moment in the darkness of the stair, looking into the antechamber, letting her eyes adjust to the quality of light, which was not the lantern light she had expected, but something else. A faint luminescence from beyond the antechamber's far door, blue-grey and unwavering, the kind of light that came from sources that had no wick. The antechamber held nothing. Stone walls, stone floor. 2 iron rings in the wall that might once have held torches. The far door was open, a thick oak door standing flush against the wall as if it had been held back deliberately. Through it, she could see the edge of the main crypt, not the center of it, just the column and the beginning of the vaulted ceiling and the edge of the light. She was not moving. This was not caution. Caution was a calculation. She had not finished the calculation, which was why she was not moving. But underneath the calculation, there was something else. Something that she did not immediately identify as a problem because it had come on gradually over the last 10 minutes. Since the passage, since the descent, since the weight of the saturation had gone from uncomfortable to something she would have described, if forced to find words for it, as pressing inward. The wounds in her palms were open in a way that was beyond their usual saturation response. She was losing blood at a rate she had not experienced since the first year of carrying them, when her body had not yet developed the management responses that an experienced stigmatic built over time. She could feel it through the dressings. The warmth, the wet, the specific weight of cloth that has absorbed as much as it can absorb. The side wound was worse still. A continuous deep pain that was no longer the navigation quality, but had become something else. A quality she associated with wrong direction. Not the pulse that said move. The sustained pressure that said this is not right. She stood in the stair doorway and held this. In 7 years, she had never had cause to question the wound's navigation. They had led her to 2 prior infernal presences, on operations before this one, and they had been accurate both times. They were a mechanism. Mechanisms did not lie, but mechanisms could be interfered with. The prophetess had told her the area would be saturated. She had said worse than you expect. The saturation was infernal in origin, which meant it was an expression of what hell produced when it operated in concentrated proximity. A kind of interference, the way a strong signal could drown a weaker one on a telegraph line. The wound's navigation mechanism required a signal. The saturation was not just background noise. It was high-intensity signal from multiple sources. The accumulated weeks of ritual preparation filling the crypt and the stone above it and the air in this antechamber with an infernal presence so dense that it was becoming difficult to distinguish between the wound's navigation and simple proximity to the source of the saturation itself. She could not be certain the pain was guiding her. She could be certain the pain was increasing. She did not know if that was the same thing. The honest assessment, and she made herself hold it rather than dismiss it in the way that operational momentum encouraged you to dismiss things, was that she had been walking toward increasing pain for 10 minutes and calling it navigation, when it was also possible that she was walking into a trap, into a situation she had not been fully briefed on, into something the prophetess's intelligence had not anticipated. The intelligence was 6 days old. 6 days of preparation had been underway since the last confirmed sighting. 6 days was time enough for the plan she was executing to have become not the plan she was executing. She stayed on the bottom stair and had this thought without rushing it. The quality of the light through the crypt door was wrong. Infernal preparation produced light of specific qualities. She had been told this, had read about it, had seen it once at a distance. The quality she was looking at was consistent with what she expected. Consistent, not certain. Consistent was a risk assessment, not a guarantee. She thought about what she knew, not what she feared. She knew Oleander's assignment to officiate a ritual whose components the briefing had described in specific technical terms. The celestial window was Thursday. She was here Wednesday night. The preparation would be at its penultimate stage, not yet the ceremony itself, which required the full configuration of the participants and the completion of certain physical arrangements in the space. The crypt would be the site of final preparation. The laying of specific materials, the completion of the ritual diagrams that required time and precision. This was consistent with a single practitioner working in a lit crypt late at night. This was not the profile of an ambush. An ambush was active. What she was looking at was a workspace. The wounds in her palms pulsed, not the sustained pressure of the side wound, the directional pulse, a single sharp instance of it, the way a compass needle swings and settles. The difference between the two types of sensation was as clear to her as the difference between a word spoken and a word shouted. Same source, same mechanism, different meaning. The sustained pressure was pain in response to infernal saturation. The pulse was the navigation function, operating through the saturation with difficulty, but operating. He was in the crypt. She had her answer. She moved through the antechamber to the door and looked through it. The crypt was larger than she had expected from the briefing's architectural description. It ran the full length of the chapter house above and then continued, an extension, or the original crypt predating the chapter house and determining its dimensions rather than the other way around. Vaulted ceiling, the ribs of the vaulting thick and low, the columns supporting them spaced every 4 meters down the length of the space. Stone sarcophagi along both walls, the abbots and benefactors of 8 centuries of monastic history, the carved effigies on the lids worn smooth by time and in 2 cases deliberately defaced, the stone faces chiseled away. Recent work. Done for reasons she could guess at. The blue-grey light came from the far end of the crypt, from a configuration she could not fully see from the doorway. Something on the floor, large, extending the full width of the space between the last 2 columns, which she identified after a moment as a ritual diagram drawn in a substance that emitted its own cold light. Chalk was the ordinary medium. This was not chalk. The light it produced did not flicker and did not respond to the movement of air. It was the byproduct of a material that was part of the preparation itself. A figure moved at the far end of the crypt within the area of the diagram. He was doing something with his hands that Margite did not watch closely. The preparation involved physical manipulation of the ritual space that she did not need to understand. What she needed to understand was the guards. There were 2 of them. They were standing at the nearer end of the crypt, one on each side, between her and the figure at the far end. They had their backs to her. They were facing inward, watching the preparation, which meant whoever had positioned them had anticipated the threat from within the crypt rather than from outside it. The guards were watching what Oleander was doing. This was not an arrangement designed for her. The guards were not positioned against an infiltrator coming down the stairs. They were positioned between Oleander and his own ritual preparations, protection against something that might emerge from the procedure rather than something that might come through the door. This was useful information. It meant the guard's primary attention was forward, toward the diagram, and not toward the staircase. Both guards were armed. She could see rifles slung across their backs, and the nearer one on the right had a revolver at his belt that he was carrying drawn and pointed at the floor. The drawn revolver told her he was more alert than his companion, or more frightened, or both. She had the silenced Colt. 4 or 5 effective shots before the modification degraded. She had the sword. She needed both guards down before either could shout or fire. The distance to the nearer guard was 8 meters. The second guard was 3 meters further, offset to the left. The gap between them was wide enough that she could not reach the second before the first had time to respond if she approached physically. She needed the pistol for both of them, in sequence, before either could react. She was a good shot. She had been taught by a castigator who was an exceptional shot, and she had practiced the way that exceptional teachers require their students to practice, which was until the mechanical components of the skill became invisible, automatic, beneath the threshold of conscious attention. At 8 meters, with a silenced revolver, she could put a round in the back of a man's head without the second man 10 meters away having time to turn before she had the pistol on him. She understood this not as confidence, but as calculation. She had the numbers. She executed the numbers. She raised the pistol and shot the right-hand guard through the base of his skull. The modified barrel produced a report like a wooden board struck hard once with an open palm, loud enough to hear, not loud enough to carry to the warming room above. The guard dropped without a sound, and she was already moving, crossing the 8 meters at a run, catching the sound of the second guard beginning to turn in response to whatever peripheral awareness registered when the man next to you dropped. The second guard was half-turned when she shot him through the temple at 2 meters, and he went down sideways against the stone sarcophagus on the left wall and slid down it and was still. She did not stop. She stepped over the first body and continued into the crypt, toward the figure at the far end, covering the ground as fast as she could manage without running. Running in the crypt was loud on the stone, and she was 15 meters from the figure before it turned. Oleander. He was a man. She registered this with the part of her mind that managed threat assessment, noting what was important. He was embodied. He was not armored. He was not holding a weapon. What he was doing was looking at her with an expression that was not fear and was not surprise. It was recognition. He was looking at her with the specific expression of someone who has received information they already had and is now verifying it. He had known someone was coming. He had not known she was here, in the crypt, right now. But he had known something was coming. The wounds in her palms screamed. It was the only word she had for it, not pain in the usual register, but something above register. A physical sensation so far outside the managed parameters of her ordinary experience of the wounds that it had the quality of a noise at a volume that passed through the body rather than being absorbed by it. She had never been this close to a partial incarnation. She had known, intellectually, that proximity would increase the response. She had not known it would be like this. She kept moving. He began to speak, something in a language she did not recognize. The cadence of it wrong, in the particular way that the Black Grail's ritual languages were always wrong. Syllables that the human vocal apparatus produced at the cost of effort because they had not been designed for it. Whatever he was beginning, she was not going to let him finish it. She had 12 meters left. She ran. He stepped back as she crossed into the ritual diagram. Not in fear, backward as a deliberate movement, controlled and measured, putting his back toward the far wall and turning so that the diagram's geometry was between them. She noted this. He wanted to stay within the diagram. He was more comfortable within the diagram than she was within it, which told her the diagram was doing something for him, not just something to the space. She felt it the moment she crossed the outer edge. Not worse in a uniform way. Worse in a way that had direction, a pressure from below, specifically from beneath the stone floor, as if the crypt floor had become thin, as if the stone were no longer the depth it appeared, and what was below it was pressing upward from a much shorter distance than the geology suggested. The wound in her side, already at the highest intensity she had experienced outside that first terrible year, underwent another increase. She filed this away. She did not slow. Oleander was still speaking. The syllables were coming faster now, an urgency entering them that had not been there before, not panic, nothing as useful as panic. Urgency in the register of a professional encountering an unexpected variable and adapting rather than failing. He had done this before. He was doing it now. She closed to 8 meters and shot him in the right shoulder. The modified barrel was still effective. She was in the crypt. The noise here was absorbed by the stone and the vaulted ceiling in a way that diffused it, and there was nobody in the antechamber to hear. The shoulder shot was deliberate. Stop the ritual without killing him before she was close enough to confirm the kill with the sword. The round she was using was blessed for infernal combat, not standard military ammunition, and it produced an effect in Oleander's body that was not what it would have produced in an ordinary human. He stopped speaking. His right arm dropped. He turned into the shot in the way that professionals turned into injury, minimizing. But the minimum in this case was still significant. The interrupted speech had been interrupted in the middle of a construction that clearly required completion, and the incomplete construction appeared to be a problem for whatever process it had been feeding. The diagram flickered. Not all of it. The central portion, a geometry of lines converging on a single point in the middle of the floor, the point toward which Oleander had been oriented when she entered, flickered once, the light guttering like a flame in wind, and then steadied. But it steadied at a lower intensity, and the pressure from below moderated slightly, and the wound in her side moderated with it. Oleander looked at her from the far wall with his right arm, hanging, and his expression had changed now from the recognition quality to something more complex. He was evaluating. The partial incarnation's intelligence was not human intelligence. She had been told this, and she believed it now, looking at his eyes, which were doing something that human eyes did not do, which was maintaining complete stillness while the rest of his face produced expressions. The eyes did not react to what the face was expressing. They were observing on a separate track. "You are a stigmatic," he said, in French that was unaccented in a way that no native speaker's French was unaccented. It was French from the outside, perfect and without texture. She crossed the remaining distance and put the sword against his throat. "I am aware of what this is," he said, indicating the blade without moving. "The chrism is correctly applied. You have a competent armourer." "Where are you, when you're not here?" she said. He looked at her. "You are incarnated partially," she said. "You are in two places. I want to know where the other part of you is." "That is not a question I'm required to answer." "I know." She kept the blade at his throat. "I'm asking anyway." He was silent for a moment. The right arm was not functioning. She could see from the quality of his stillness that it was not simply injured, but disrupted, the blessed round having done something to the interface between his human body and whatever occupied it that was more than tissue damage. He was not going to use that arm. "The seventh circle," he said, "where I have been since 1248. She held this. 1248. She did not know what had happened in 1248. She knew that the Black Grail's history extended into the medieval Crusades, that the fracture in hell that had produced Beelzebub's court had its origins in the aftermath of the First Crusade, that the very long perspective was real for those who existed within it. She knew these things as facts. Hearing a man who had been standing in an abbey crypt for most of the past month, say since 1248, gave the facts a character they did not have as facts. "You have been running this war for 700 years, she said. "Contributing to it," he said. "It is not a single war. It is a single direction of travel." The diagram flickered again. Not the ritual. She had interrupted the ritual. The flickering was residual, the system decaying without maintenance input. The light at the convergence point was dimming. "How many of you are there?" she said. "Incarnated. On this side." "More than you have been told," he said, which she believed because it was true in the way that everything he said was true, in the way of a thing that had no use for lies in the ordinary human sense. She thought about the wound in her side, the way it had increased as she entered the crypt, peaked when she crossed the diagram, the way it had moderated, slightly, when the ritual interrupted, the way it was now at a sustained intensity that was not decreasing despite her physical proximity to him having remained constant. The moderation when she interrupted the ritual was not because of oleander. It was because the ritual preparation had been maintaining a connection that the interruption had partially closed. The connection was not fully closed. It was diminished. The thing that the ritual was opening, the conduit, the prophetess had called it, was not yet open, but was not yet fully shut either. Killing oleander would close it. He had said he was the officiator. Without the officiator, the junior staff were not qualified. But the conduit was still there, still partially open, still pressing up through the floor with a weight that was not entirely the saturation of weeks of preparation, but was beginning to be something else. If she waited long enough, if the conversation continued, if she let the remaining light in the diagram decay slowly rather than abruptly. There was a question of whether the decay was irreversible or whether it reached a minimum and held there, waiting for someone else to continue the work. She had not been briefed on this. She had been briefed on oleander. "What happens to the conduit if you die?" she said. He looked at her, and this time the eyes changed too. A flicker of something she would have called, in a human, respect. "It closes," he said, "permanently. This alignment does not recur for 17 years. The materials and the location are specific. It would need to begin from nothing." She accepted this. She had asked and he had answered, and she had decided, 700 years of war or not, that he was not a liar. She killed him. The body did not behave the way a body behaved. She had known it would not. The briefing had been clear. A partially incarnated operative of the Seventh Circle was in two places at the same moment, the human body and its origin. And when the human body was killed, the connection between them severed, and the severing was not quiet. The prophetess had said, "Be clear of the crypt if you can manage it." She had not specified what if you can manage it was mitigating. She had not specified what happened if you could not manage it. What happened was light, not from the body, from the diagram. The decay that had begun when she interrupted the ritual reversed. Not to the level it had been at when she entered the crypt, not to the operational intensity of the preparation, but upward from the diminished state it had fallen to, a rapid intensification that reached a peak in the 3 seconds after the body hit the stone floor and then began to die, properly this time, the light contracting toward the convergence point in a rapid inward collapse. The light was not fire, but it had heat in it, not physical heat. The air temperature did not change, but the kind of heat that the wounds responded to, which was something other than temperature, and they responded fully, all 5 of them, a total body response that she had never experienced before in 7 years and had not been warned about. She went to her knees, not from a decision, from the legs simply declining to maintain their function for a period that she later estimated as approximately 30 seconds. The wound in her side, the lance wound, the deepest and oldest and worst, opened in a way that felt from the inside like a door had been thrown back on it, a sudden full exposure to whatever it was oriented toward, the sacred or the infernal, and in this particular location, with the conduit closing, both simultaneously, the distinction between them clear and exact, and at the same time closer to each other than she had ever felt them to be. She had a thought, on her knees on the cold stone of the crypt of the Abbey of Sant'Ilario, while the light died around her, that she would not have allowed herself in an operational context if she had been able to prevent it. She had a thought about God, not a question. She was 31 years old and had been living with the wounds of a Metachrist for 7 years, and she had moved beyond questions of the kind that younger stigmatics still asked. The thought was simpler than a question. It was the thought of a person who's been cold for a long time, suddenly near a fire, not surprise, not analysis, simple acknowledgement, something that required no further examination. The light died. The crypt was dark. Not fully. The 2 lanterns she had seen in the briefing as the antechamber's sources were still burning, and their light reached the crypt entrance. But the blue-grey luminescence of the diagram was gone, completely, and the diagram itself was gone. The material it had been drawn in had consumed itself in the final collapse, leaving nothing on the stone floor except a faint scorching, visible in the lantern light as a shadow on the pale stone. The wound in her side settled, not to 0. It had not been at 0 since the day it came to her. But it settled to its baseline, the pain that was always there and that she had learned, over years, to experience as simply the cost of the mechanism, the way a craftsman learns to experience the weight of his tools as part of the work rather than opposition to it. She stood up. Her palms had bled through the dressings entirely. There was blood on the stone floor in the 2 places she had knelt. She looked at this, and then she looked at the body on the far side of the crypt, and then she looked at the scorched floor where the diagram had been. She needed to move. The guards in the warming room above had not heard the modified pistol shots over the quality of the stone and the closed doors. She believed this because they had not come down the stairs. But the collapse of the diagram, whatever it had produced in this space in its last 30 seconds, was not something that the human senses could detect in the way they detected sound or light. It was a pressure, a quality of change in the air, and most people felt changes like that as nothing more than an unease, a sudden alertness without identified cause. Most people. She did not know these particular guards well enough to know what they would do with a sudden unease at 10:30 at night in the crypt they were stationed above. She gave herself 30 more seconds. She used them to wipe the sword blade on the back of the nearer guard's coat, which she felt was acceptable given the circumstance. She resheathed the sword. She checked the revolver. 2 rounds expended, 3 remaining. She checked the dressings on her palms, which were saturated, and made the decision that she could not redress them here in the dark without the time it would require, and moved the calculation to the exit point. She went back to the staircase. At the top of the stairs, she stopped and listened. The voices in the warming room were still there, a single voice now, not two, someone talking to themselves or to no one, a low murmur that she identified as a man praying or a man going through a habitual repetition. The second guard had either left or stopped talking. She could not determine which from the corridor without opening the door. She waited for 3 full minutes. The voice continued. The corridor was quiet beyond it. The door to the passage through the church was 10 meters of lit corridor away, and the door itself was where she had left it, slightly ajar, which she needed to address before she went through because it had been closed when she came the other way, and a door left open was exactly the kind of small wrongness that a guard on a long, quiet watch noticed. She moved through the corridor at a walk, pulled the passage door carefully to its original position, not fully closed, but nearly, the gap she had left preserved, and went through. The church, the nave, the south transept door. She checked through the crack before opening it. The cloister guard was at the far end of his beat. She opened the door and was across the courtyard into the shadow of the east wall before he had turned. She was back over the cemetery wall in less than 2 minutes. Standing in the dark of the cemetery, she allowed herself one full breath, the kind that goes all the way down and all the way back. And then she turned north and began the 7 kilometers to the wire. The 7 kilometers back were not the same 7 kilometers that she had come. The route was the same ground, the same lanes and fields, and the same village margin in the dark. What was different was her. She had lost more blood in the crypt than she had planned for, and the blood loss had a character that ordinary blood loss did not have, which was that it was not only physiological. The wounds of the third Metachrist, when they operated at high intensity for a sustained period, left a cost behind them that was not easily measured in clinical terms. She was not dizzy. She was not weakened in the normal sense. She was simply less, a faint quality of reduction. The sensation of having run a very long distance and not yet stopped, her resources at some low percentage of what they had been when she set out. She could manage this. She had planned for a degraded return. It was standard planning for a stigmatic operative going into saturated ground, the recognition that the approach was always easier than the return because the return came after the work. She moved through the dark at a pace that was sustainable rather than fast. Fast would have felt better. Movement created its own momentum, its own argument against stopping. But fast would also have been unsustainable for 7 kilometers in the dark over bad ground, and an unsustainable pace that broke down halfway was worse than a sustainable pace that completed the distance. She passed the village of the morning, the one she had circled going in. She circled it again, giving it the same margin, and this time the lights in the large stone billet were out. Not completely. A single upper window was lit, which meant a guard or an officer asleep with a lamp going, but the ground floor was dark and there was no sign of the patrol that had been running the market square hours earlier. She made a note of this without drawing conclusions. Patrols that weren't visible weren't necessarily absent. She extended her margin by 200 meters on the north side and came back to her approach lane well clear of the billet. The wound in her side was stable. This was new. She had experienced the post-saturation settlement before on the reconnaissance 3 months ago. But on that occasion, the return crossing had been brief. She had been 2 kilometers inside the wire, not 7. And the wounds had remained elevated for the full return. Here, with the conduit collapsed and the source of the saturation removed, The ambient pressure was already diminishing. She could feel the difference in the quality of the pain, the same way she could feel the difference in the quality of a room when a fire in it was allowed to die. Not gone. Less, and still diminishing. The Black Grail's operational infrastructure in this sector had just become measurably smaller. One official less, one conduit that would not be opened for 17 years. She held this information the way she held all information about the outcomes of her work, which was without sentiment and without satisfaction. Satisfaction was a closed-loop emotion. It required the situation to be complete, and the situation was never complete. The situation was the 100-Year War, and the 100-Year War would outlast every individual action within it, including hers. What mattered was that the action had been taken. The calculation had been correct. The wounds had guided her, and she had followed them, and the conduit was closed. She needed to cross a farm creek that she had waded on the approach. It was running higher than it had been. The overnight temperature had dropped further than she expected, and the higher water was cold enough that she felt it through her boots and then through her feet in a way that was simply physical cold and not the wound's way of registering things, which was clarifying in its way. Some things were just cold, some things were just mud. The work she did was in a world where supernatural forces were operating at significant scale, but the creek was still a creek, and the cold was still cold, and her feet were still wet, and the wire was still 4 kilometers away. She kept walking. 2 kilometers from the wire, she found the drainage ditch where she had spent the day. She had not planned to stop there on the return. It was an unnecessary delay. She was on a timeline for the approach to dawn. But she stopped anyway for 5 minutes, long enough to use the last of her reserve dressings on her palms, because the bleeding had continued throughout the crossing, and the state of the outer surfaces of her gloves had become a problem she could not continue to ignore. The gloves were dark, but the saturation was visible in texture, the cloth stiff where it had dried and wet where it had not, and the smell of it was present in a way that a dog would find at 50 meters. She wrapped both palms with the remaining dressings and abandoned the gloves in the ditch. Cold hands were a problem. Visible bloodied gloves were a larger problem. She moved on. The wire came up at 3 in the morning, visible in the ambient light from both sets of flares. The heretic line's irregular pattern was now running every 12 to 15 minutes, which was slightly more relaxed than the 8 to 12 of her outward crossing. This was not an indicator of changed alertness. This was the natural rhythm of a long watch in the small hours of the morning, when the human capacity for sustained attention reached its lowest point and the flare intervals extended not from deliberate policy, but from the simple fact that the soldier on the cord had drifted slightly. She found the gap in the heretic wire she had made on the way in. The cut ends were where she had bent them, undisturbed. She went through on her belly and kept moving, through the wire and into the crater field, and 30 minutes later she found the gap in the faithful wire that Brother Obededom had shown her, marked with the scrap of white cloth at knee height, and she went through, and she was in the trench. She sat down in the trench with her back against the forward wall and her legs extended, and she stayed there for a full minute. Then she stood up and went to find the castigator. He was where she expected to find him. Not at the wire. He would not have stayed at the wire for 7 hours in October without cause. And she had told him not to. He was in the fire bay, 40 meters down the trench from the wire crossing, sitting on an ammunition crate with his back against the parapet wall in the posture of a man who was technically asleep, but was not actually asleep. His rifle was across his knees. His eyes were closed, but his breathing was wrong for sleep. Too deliberate, too managed. A man who had been waiting. He heard her footsteps on the duckboard and opened his eyes. She stopped in front of him, and he looked at her from the crate without expression, taking in what was visible in the pre-dawn dark. The hands, probably, the state of the dressings, the way she was standing. He was a man who could read a returning operative the way you read weather. He had been doing it for 20 years. "Done?" he said. "Done." He stood up and slung the rifle. He did not ask for a report. That was for the prophetess in the morning, in the farmhouse, with the intelligence brief on the table and the maps in front of them. What he asked instead was, "How bad?" She held up her hands. The dressings were visible even in this light. He nodded and reached into his coat and produced a flask. He held it out without comment. She took it. It was brandy, which was not a medicinal choice, but was a correct one under the circumstances. "Side," he said. "Stable. The source is gone. The ambient is already dropping." He nodded again. He had no particular relationship with the theology of the wounds. He was not a stigmatic, had never served as a castigator to one before Margite, had learned what he knew from observation rather than doctrine. But he had observed enough to understand the basic principles, the same way a man who was not a carpenter could learn to read the quality of wood from spending time around carpenters. "The prophetess will want you at first light," he said. "I know. You have 2 hours." She looked at him. The grey eyes were doing the thing they did, which was seeing clearly and not requiring explanation or context. "There's a question you're not asking," she said. "Several," he said. "I'll ask them in the morning, through the correct channels, with the prophetess present." "The question about the conduit," she said. "Whether I had a clear kill, or whether I was managing a conversation." He was quiet for a moment. The guns to the south fired intermittently. The overnight rate, the background fire that never fully stopped in any sector on the Italian front. The war reminding itself it was still there. "Did you?" he said. "I had a clear kill. I did not take it immediately. I had a conversation first." He did not respond to this. He was not the prophetess. His function was not theological assessment of Margite's operational decision-making. His function was the whip and the rifle, and, in this specific moment, sitting in a fire bay at 3 a.m, waiting for a stigmatic to come back through the wire. "What did you learn?" he said, which was not a theological question. It was a practical one. "That there are more of them on this side than we have been told," she said. "Partially incarnated, more than we have been told." He looked at her. "He said that voluntarily?" I asked directly. He answered. He had no use for misdirection at that point. Obededom sat back down on the ammunition crate and put his rifle across his knees again. He was processing this with the specific stillness of a man who received information he had suspected was true and was now experiencing the discomfort of having his suspicion confirmed. "The prophetess will want that in the brief," he said. "I know." "Go sleep," he said. 2 hours. She went. The prophetess's tent at first light. The same farmhouse table, the same map with its red notations, the same flat-palmed posture, the prophetess sitting as she always sat during intelligence work, contained and precise. Brother Obededom was there. Brother Arsenios was there with a blank ledger open on his knee to record the debrief. Outside, the guns were already at their daytime rate, the overnight background fire replaced by the more purposeful exchange of a front that had been exchanging fire at this rate for 2 years, without either side having moved a significant distance. Margite reported in the order the prophetess preferred. Timeline, actions taken, observed conditions, outcomes confirmed, observed conditions again, contingencies encountered, information obtained. She did not provide commentary or analysis during the report. She provided facts. The analysis was for the prophetess to conduct and for Arsenios to record, and for the intelligence apparatus of the faithful to determine what to do with. When she got to the conversation in the crypt, the prophetess stopped her. "He told you there were more than we have been told," she said. "Yes. More than we have been told by our own networks, or more than we have been told by the High Command." Margite had not asked this distinction. She had not had time to ask this distinction. "I don't know," she said. "The phrasing was more than you have been told. I interpreted it as general." The prophetess was still for a long moment. Arsenios was writing. Obededom was looking at the table. "The distinction matters," the prophetess said, in a tone that was not reproach, but was extremely specific in its qualities. "More than our networks know is an intelligence gap. More than High Command is reporting is a different problem." "Yes," Margite said. "You had no opportunity to clarify?" He was dying when he said it. The prophetess accepted this. She did not say anything about the conversation having taken place at all. Margite had expected this to be the subject of more inquiry, the question of why Oleander had been permitted to speak rather than simply killed. Perhaps the prophetess had decided that the intelligence obtained was sufficient justification for the approach Margite had taken. Perhaps she had decided that the approach was tactically questionable and would discuss it separately. Margite did not know and did not ask. The rest of the debrief took 40 minutes. When it was over, the prophetess dismissed Obededom and Arsenios and asked Margite to remain. They sat across the table from each other in the morning light. "The wounds," the prophetess said. "Stable," Margite said. "I'm not asking about the current state." She was looking at Margite with the full attention quality, the prophet's assessment that went beyond what was visible. "I'm asking about the experience inside the crypt, at the end." Margite had not included this in the debrief. It was not operational information. The collapse of the diagram, the kneeling on the stone, the thought about God that she had not been able to prevent, none of it belonged in an intelligence record. "The conduit's collapse was more severe than I expected," Margite said. "The wounds responded at a level I have not experienced previously. I was temporarily unable to stand." "How long?" 30 seconds, perhaps less. The prophetess nodded slowly. She was not surprised by this, which told Margite that the prophetess had known something about what would happen that had not been included in the briefing. She had been told to be clear of the crypt if you can manage it. The prophetess had known she might not manage it. "You were inside the diagram," Eudokia said. "When it collapsed." "Yes. I had hoped you would be clear of it." "I was not." "What did you experience?" The prophetess asked this in the register she used when she was asking a prophetic question, which was a different register from the intelligence voice, stripped of the dry precision and replaced with something quieter and more direct. She was not asking for an operational report. She was asking as a prophet asks, because she needed to know what had been seen. Margite looked at the table. She looked at the map, which was covered in the marks of 100 operations, 100 movements of forces across this portion of the Veneto and the territories south of Verona, the architecture of a war that was also a theology. She thought about how to answer a question that she had been carrying for 2 hours since the drainage ditch, since she had stood up in the trench with her legs working again and set her face north. "The distinction," she said, "between the sacred and the infernal. I felt it very clearly." "In what way?" "As proximity." She paused. "Both directions, simultaneously, from the same place." The prophetess was silent for a moment. "The crypt of a consecrated abbey," she said. "That has been the site of weeks of infernal preparation." "Yes. And what did you take from that?" "That the distinction is real," Margite said, which I already knew, and that proximity to both sides of it at the same moment is not. I had assumed it would be unbearable. It was not unbearable. What was it? She looked for the word and found it. Clear, she said. The prophetess looked at her for a long moment, and then she looked out the small window of the farmhouse at the grey October morning, the mud and the trees stripped of their leaves, and the distant line of the parapets against the sky. The wounds cost you something last night, she said. Yes. More than the blood. Yes. And you are whole? Margite considered the question with the seriousness it required. She sat with it and turned it over and applied the kind of honesty to it that the question warranted, the kind that was possible at 5 a.m. after a night in occupied Veneto, when the resources that normally performed the management functions of self-presentation were below operational minimum. I am changed, she said. I don't know yet if that is the same thing. The prophetess accepted this. Rest, she said. The wound assessment this evening. The full medical review tomorrow. Margite stood. She was at the door when Eudokia said, without turning from the window, "What he told you, about more of them. On this side." "Yes. Write it down. Everything you can remember about how it was phrased, the context, the moment. Don't wait until the formal record. Do it while the memory is exact." "I will." The distinction he left ambiguous, the prophetess said, was deliberate. He knew it would matter to us, and he chose not to be specific, and that choice was the last service he performed for his masters. Margite stood in the doorway. "I know," she said. She went out into the October morning, and the guns were going, and the mud was cold under her feet, and somewhere in the crypt of the Abbey of Sant'Ilario, the scorched